Nigeria will join several other African countries for 2 days for talks with Russia from Thursday. Moscow's grain exports and Africa's stance in Russia's war with Ukraine are set to top the agenda at the summit. It comes as many countries in Africa are facing a cost of living crisis. Discussions could also center around the controversial role of the Wagner military group in several African countries. The previous summit in 2019 led to the signing of 92 agreements and contracts worth over $11 billion.
All right, let's bring in African affairs analyst and international terrorism consultant David Otto to discuss this with us. Thank you so much.
Welcome, David.
It's good to see you on Newsnight.
Thank you, Bob.
Well, apparently it's not the first time that Russia and Africa will be meeting. 2019, just as we pointed out there, 92 agreements signed and what have you. But how much do African leaders need to take away from this summit for it to be in any way mutually beneficial?
Well, that is the expectation, mutual benefit. But before we talk about mutual benefits, I think it's important to align the strategic objective. You know, often we've said before, and as you said, you know, there was a previous conference in 2019 where you had about 43, African leaders attending. Now we have an increase in about 6, so 49 expected, to attend. The question is, should African countries be actually going to Russia? Should the continent, go to a country, or should a country come to the continent?
Right. Many have raised.
Yes, so I think that's a crucial question. But time is everything, and everything is timing.
Absolutely.
And because we have a scenario where the war in Ukraine, which Russia calls special military operation, Ukraine calls it a war of aggression, that has impacted on issues of grains, as you know, and fertilizer, and has increased the living cost in most of the world, Africa inclusive. So perhaps we can excuse African countries going to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, to have this conference on the basis that there might be some leverage, which Russia could provide.
Yeah, how much
in
leverage
terms of,
is what we're looking at
now. This is the key. In terms of how much leverage, it would be left to be seen, how prepared African countries are, because we're talking about 49 countries. How are they approaching, the Russian question? Is it going as a bloc, or is it individual countries? Now, if Russia decides to divide and rule them, then you see a possibility where agreements will be signed individually, which doesn't really benefit the African bloc. So I think the argument is, should African countries should all of them be going to Russia, or should they have nominated a committee to argue for the benefit of Africa? I think, the only way they can benefit in terms of maybe, trying to agree on Russia allowing some grains to come to Africa, at a very low cost, or, supply of fertilizers.
Which Russia has said
Let me take you up on that.
address.
Yeah, Russia had an agreement with Turkey last year about grain supplies to Africa, but the agreement has not been renewed. What are the possibilities of the African countries pushing for the renewal of that agreement?
Now, this is where I'm saying that it depends on how they approach Russia. Of course, Africa has 49 representatives expected to attend. If they approach Russia as a bloc, then Russia is likely to allow that agreement to go forward, benefiting African countries. But if they approach Russia individually, then there's a question of there's a possibility that Russia may decide to do what it did in 2019 and sign contracts and MOUs with individual countries. So it depends on the strategy. But from what we can see, the same thing happened with the Japan African Conference Summit, the US Africa Summit, the Chinese Africa Summit. What we say is African countries, playing God in terms of trying to posture themselves as individual nations. Now, if you want to benefit from Russia, Russia is actually in a very tight position. Russia wants Africa more than Africa wants Russia, so they have to go as a bloc, and that way, we can have some kind of, negotiations and leverage on this issue of grain and fertilizer.
Right.
And of course,
As a matter of fact, it looks like the rest of the world actually needs Africa more than Africa needs the rest of the world. I mean,
of course,
there's China-Africa Summit, Japan-Africa Summit, there's been the US-Africa Summit.
Numbers.
Everybody seems to want to have something to do with Africa, but how can African leaders take advantage of this?
Yes,
optimally?
and this is what we're saying. The first thing is to allow those countries to come to you. That's the first leverage. We have the African Union. We have Addis Ababa as the capital of the African Union, the headquarters. If maybe for some reason people would say, "Oh, we don't like Addis," or create, some kind of an independent, African country that you feel. Nigeria, for example, has the capabilities, the structural capabilities to host, this kind of bring the likes of China, the US, Russia, Japan, France, bring them to the conference in Africa, and then you leverage with your economic and your political or social from a position of strength. Right. I do not buy the fact that African leaders go to Russia. Why should the continent be going to a country when a country should be coming to the continent?
How much of a security risk is that even when all?
And of course, you have. I mean, I was going to talk about the security risk. Russia is actively at war. I mean, even if the war is being fought mostly or majority in Ukraine. But we've seen situations where strikes could be, it could happen. Accidents could happen. Why should all our leaders, from our continent, take such a risk, from a security point of view?
That brings to mind the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine on Africa. How then can African leaders take advantage of this summit to have a conversation with Russia to minimize the impact of that war on Africa?
I think it has to do with there are two levels. One, the impact of the war on Africa would be on the economic side of it, which we've talked about. What about the military side, where African countries, some of them, for example, Mali, the likes of Burkina Faso, the likes of Central African Republic, Mozambique, they rely on private military contractors like Wagner Group. So now these are individual state decisions, that, agreements have been signed with the government of Russia. So, those kind of agreements, can only be, made much more effective if, again, they go as a bloc and say, instead of sending private military contractors, why don't we have, the Russian regular forces? Because, of course, Russia has replaced some of the Wagner forces, or they've reintegrated the Wagner forces into the regular forces, after the so-called mutiny. And what African countries should be asking is, why don't we have the same change of operations? Bring in your Russian regular forces instead of giving us Wagner military contractors. But again, it's down to the terms of the agreements that have all been signed by these countries and Wagner.
So, from all indication, there seems to be some weakening of Russia's role in the global community. Back to that question: how Africa can actually take advantage of a weakening Russia.
Yes, but they're not taking advantage of it because, of course, they are going to Russia, and that itself, the fact that Russia is having 49 African countries represented in this conference in St. Petersburg, puts Russia in a stronger position. It therefore means to the rest of the world, the likes of NATO and the West, that Russia is still breathing, and all the sanctions that the West has leveled upon Russia, that hasn't.
How disadvantageous is it for African countries to be neutral in this Russia, Ukraine war?
I think
many are neutral. A few others are in support of Russia.
Yes, I think there's a huge advantage, in always putting national interest first, and every country should be able to do that. So if African countries believe that it is in their national interest or in the interest of the continent to be neutral, then they should be neutral. This is an African, a Russia summit, not a Russia-African summit.
David Otto, you know what? Perhaps after this summit, we may have to get you back to have a review of the event in St. Petersburg. Thank you very much for joining us on Newsnight. David Otto is an African Affairs analyst.